So 25 years after our church was founded, Midnight Cowboy won the Best Oscar for Best Picture. And it wasn't an obvious choice at the time. It had really big competition. It was up against John Wayne's True Grit, one of his last Westerns. And they were also up against Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, that fantastic vehicle for Robert Redford and Paul Newman. So really, really big competition, and yet it won. And that was a huge surprise to everyone. It was a surprise for all sorts of reasons. One surprise was that it was an X-rated movie. It is so far the first and only X-rated movie to have ever won an Academy Award. Why was it X-rated? Well, by today's standards, it doesn't seem all that racy. There's no sex really that happens on screen. It all happens off screen. But when it was submitted to the censorship boards, some psychologists looked at it and said, it has scenes of homosexuality, and that will be disturbing to many. So they decided to slap an X on it. The gay director, John Schlesinger, didn't mind. He realized that this would probably boost its publicity potential, and he was right. Midnight Cowboy is the story of two marginalized young men in New York City. Joe Buck, played by John Voight, is a young Texan who arrives in New York City wearing a cowboy hat and boots. His dream is to be a male prostitute, a hustler of rich women. But the women of New York are way too worldly for him, so they end up taking his money rather than the other way around. And he's plunged into poverty. They steal his money, other people steal his money, and pretty soon he's penniless. One of the people who robs him is Rico, played by a young Dustin Hoffman. He's a gay man with a limp who's also a petty thief. They become friends, and Rico invites him to live in his apartment, which is in an abandoned building with no heat, no electricity, and they freeze in the dark often. Rico is in love with Joe, but it's unrequited. Nevertheless, they form a really strong, loving bond, which lasts throughout the entire movie. And they stick with each other through thick and thin, even as they're ripped off and ignored by the rest of New York City. Back in 1969, critics were not kind to this film. One of the things they objected to was that it has these long montage sequences where we hear pop songs and the guy's just walking around. That was a new thing back then, very common in films like rom-coms now, but back then it was new and they didn't really like it. And the other thing they didn't like were the actual characters themselves. In Variety's review in 1969 of this movie, the words homo and cripple come up. They were anything but sympathetic to the people they were meeting in this movie. And this was a time when you could call someone that, and it was just the end of the conversation. You could pass judgment on someone with a single word, as though that was all you needed to know about a person. And the conversation would end. Well, we all hope that we've come further than that in our modern age. Obviously being a homosexual doesn't mean the same thing as it did in 1970 to the general public, and that's a good thing. But other terms have replaced them, right? We still have judgmental labels that we slap on people like homeless or transgendered or even now Trumpist. Labels that sum up who a person is in just a word, as though that's all we needed to know about them. But in today's gospel reading, we are implored by Jesus, don't judge. Judge not lest thee be judged, is the way the King James Version has it. It sounds like a commandment, and that's often all we hear or remember. But as you heard in the passage that Danielle read, it's actually part of a much longer section in the Sermon on the Mount. And immediately following those words, judge not, comes the story of the famous image of two people facing each other, one with a speck and the other with a log in their eye. Nothing in the New Testament is put there carelessly. Ink and scrolls cost too much. And as I pointed out earlier, this was a secret society, so they had to keep the stuff which they wrote down pretty small. So if Jesus says, judge not, and then immediately follows it up with a parable. Those two ideas must be linked. So let's explore that a little bit. The idea that when you see the speck in someone else's eye, you shouldn't try to pluck it out because you've got a log in your eye is a really vivid image. And if you take it literally, it would look like this. A big, big log in your eye, making it impossible to see anything. And so that's such a ridiculous image. We can't be talking just about literal sight here. We must be talking about spiritual sight. And spiritual sight means the state of your soul and the state of someone else's soul. So you think that you can see into another person's mind, into their soul, and you see a flaw. But before you try to fix them, Jesus is saying you should try and fix the impairment in your own spiritual vision. All those faults in ourselves, which we happily overlook so we can criticize others. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't say, take care of the speck in your eye before you deal with the speck in someone else's eye. He says, no, actually, you've got a log in your eye. He's implying that your urge to judge others is that log. You are actually doing something which impairs your vision of the world because you want to judge it. That raises the question, well, why is judging someone so wrong? I mean, there are bad people out there who do bad things. Are we not supposed to judge them? Are we not supposed to reach an assessment about them? Why should our spiritual state be impaired by calling them out on it? Let's face it, judging others can be a delicious pastime, right? It makes you feel good when you judge others. You feel like you've sort of climbed up on a ladder and you're looking down on other people. You can puff yourself up and feel much more confident about yourself when you're passing judgment on somebody else. But the harm in judging others is that we think that we're seeing clearly, but we're not. And this is why Christ chose a metaphor about sight to speak about the dangers of judgment. In Midnight Cowboy, people think they know everything they need to know about Joe and Rico when they see them on the street. Hustler, homosexual, cripple. But as the film shows, they're much more than this. These two men whom society has labeled as worthless are loving towards each other. And they have dreams and they have nightmares. Joe Buck is haunted by a past that he never talks about. We see it in flashbacks. He's suffered some pretty traumatic experiences in his past. We see him and a young woman having sex, and then a gang comes upon them, pulls them apart, chases them around, and then rapes both of them. He's obviously traumatized by this. And no one could ever guess that that's what happened to him just by looking at him. And it appears that he's come to New York to somehow reassert his masculinity, to take control of his sexuality again. That seems to be what motivates him into turning into a hustler. But to anybody else who sees him, they have no idea what's going on with him or why he's doing that. They have no idea what's haunting him. And we're all like that. We're all more complex than any label could ever capture. In our neighborhood, these issues have come up a lot lately because of the establishment of the Roehampton shelter down near Yonge and Eglinton. The labels that are being tossed around, both on social media as well as in conversation, are like homeless, addict, criminal. The local neighborhood has been divided over the shelter's existence. Many people wish it had never been established at all, while others are saying, okay, it's here, let's see what we can do to help. But the overall animosity towards the shelter has been clear. And the city's found that one way of dealing with that is that they form committees that provide a chance to have a liaison with the rest of the community. They're called community liaison committees, and they are attended once a month by people from like condo boards and residents associations and local churches. And myself and some of the other local clergy in this area attend those meetings every month. And it's a good way to learn who lives there. For instance, it turns out that most of the people who live in the shelter are around the age of 50. Most of them are men, although not all. There are couples. It is a former hotel, so people get rooms to themselves. They don't sleep in big, big dorms. And some people are addicted to opioids. But I've been told a number of times that doesn't mean that they're lying comatose on their beds all day. Some people can function quite well on opioids. But overdoses do continue to occur, and one happened on the day before Christmas Eve, and that person died. Lately, the shelter's biggest challenge has been a COVID-19 outbreak, which started just before Christmas. An outbreak means that the disease is being spread among the people in a particular place, and so a couple of people didn't realize they had COVID, but they brought it into the shelter and then it started to spread. So they decided to do the logical thing, which was to test everybody. So they held a testing day and everybody came in, got that dreaded jab up your nose. And it took all day and well into the night, because by dinner time, although most of the residents had been swabbed, there was still a bunch who weren't in the building who hadn't come in yet. So the medical team waited and people started coming in. And it wasn't until really, really late in the day, well after dinner time, that they were able to test everyone. And so they asked, where have you been? And they said, well, I was at work. That's right. There's actually lots of people at the shelter who have jobs. And when we heard this at the meeting, which happened last week, our committee, we're all going, what do you mean they have jobs? How could they have jobs? They're homeless people. But it turns out that actually in the shelter system, there's lots of people who have paying jobs. They're homeless, not unemployed. Their problem is they can't find affordable housing. And we were told that since dating about 6 months ago, the whole shelter system in Toronto has seen on average every single month 600 new people who have never been homeless before, many of them who have jobs, who now have to live in shelters because they simply can't find a place to live that they can afford. That's where we're at in Toronto. So what does it mean to call someone homeless? As a label, it doesn't really reveal much beyond the state of your housing. But in practice, when we say a homeless person, obviously it comes with this whole halo of value judgments. They're poor. We may assume that they're too lazy to work, that they've made bad life choices, and that's why they're ended up on the street. The term homeless isn't just a description. It's often used as a judgment. This week, I was told by a street nurse that one of the reasons a lot of homeless people turn to drugs is because they are told day in, day out that they are worthless. People tell it to their faces when they're out on the street looking for money, and they can just feel it in the way people look at them. Over and over again, they're burdened with that value judgment. And that judgmentalism translates into policy. In the city of Toronto, the average homeless person is fined over and over again by the police for loitering. This is very, very common. On average, people experiencing homelessness have 42 interactions with police each year. 42. How many interactions with the police have you had in a typical year? And many of those interactions with the police result in tickets being written, which the police know they're not going to be able to pay, and yet they get fined for not paying them. And then when they don't show up to court because they didn't pay them, they end up with a long list of priors. In Toronto, a study was made of the residents of our jail population, and it turns out that 1/5 of them were homeless at the time that they were put in jail. So these value judgments that we make, homeless, have really, really devastating impacts on the future of people's lives. So we shouldn't take these things lightly. Our gospel passage today suggests that there's a better way. We're told that if we can resist the temptation to judge others, we can have the capacity to take that log out of our eye. But once it's removed, Jesus doesn't say, don't worry about the speck in other people's eyes, just move on. He says, no, help them remove the speck from their eye. Help them get over what's ever holding them back now that you're not being judgmental. You have a new power once you cease being judgmental to help other people. They're much more likely to listen to you, know that they're being listened to. Someone who's lost hope or is embroiled in anger or despair, those things can really cloud your vision. It could be your spouse, your friend, or a stranger. Jesus seems to be saying, until you deal with your own pride and egotism, you won't have the right kind of vision to help another person. We're wrong most of the time when we judge. We don't really know what's going on in another person's mind. We don't know what they've struggled with in the past. We just think we do. But the truth is, like Joe Buck, we have no idea what kind of trauma someone's dealing with. We don't know if what they're doing right now is the best possible thing they could do given their past or the worst. We're just not in a position to know. The first step in wisdom is realizing that you don't have much of your own. Once we stop judging, once we take that log out of our eye, Jesus suggests that we're on the beginning of a really important spiritual journey. These are the words you heard near the end of the scripture that Danielle read. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door will be opened. Notice how those are 3 stages. They're not equivalent statements. When I ask for something, I know exactly what I want. But when I seek for something, I'm not so sure. I can go job seeking. I'm not sure where I'm going to end up working. I can go house hunting. I don't know the exact address that I'm going to get. Seeking is more open-ended. Seeking says, I trust in the process to give me something that I want or that I need or that I'm willing to help with. And then the final one, knocking on the door. Well, what's behind the door? There, the trust in God has to be total because you don't know what's on the other side of the door. Ask, seek, knock. It denotes a progressive surrender to God's help. A progressive degree of trust where you're becoming more and more trusting that God will help you if you decide to walk in God's way. The spiritual path isn't about knowing exactly how everything works. It can't even start as long as we're slapping judgmental labels on everything we see. Judgment is like a lockdown that condemns us to be stuck in our own little homes, our own little worlds. Our spiritual journey is about giving up on that certainty so we can be open to the world and open to possibility. When we decide not to judge, our vision clears, and that log is taken out of our eye. We see more than we suspected was ever possible in the world. The world becomes more rich and more accurate. And in that openness, God reveals a way of living where we'll be rewarded as we seek to help God heal this world. And it all doors open to places we never suspected we could go. And it all starts, that wonderful journey starts when we agree to cease being judgmental, when we decide to judge not and let our vision clear. And that's a journey you can go on, one step at a time. Amen.